So, for a new government, the first question says explain the following statement. Texas had been ruled by many different governments before becoming part of the United States. So that question is asking us, what does that sentence mean? What does it mean that Texas had been ruled by many different governments? Yes, Alexa.
Can you text my mom like the my username or the email that I need for the math test? Because it's asking me for it.
It's the same password that you normally use, Alexa. Password is the username, password is the password.
Okay, thank you.
Question number 2 says, what changes did Hernan Cortez bring to the land we now know as Texas? So when we start seeing that name, Hernan Cortez, we want to see what changes did he bring to Texas? How did he change Texas? Question number 3 says, in what ways were presidios and missions the same? So they're going to be talking about two different things in our information, presidios and missions. When we get to that part, we want to see, is there anything that they have that's the same? Question 4 says, in what ways were presidios and missions different? So this is really similar to question number 3, but this time instead of saying how are they the same, how are they similar, it's how are they different? Now what makes them separate? Why aren't they the same thing? Question 5, how was the government different under Mexican rule than it was under the rule of Spain? So they're going to be talking about two different people or two different countries that are in charge, Spain and Mexico. And they want us to tell them, when Mexico took over, how was it different? What changed? What did Mexico do differently than Spain did? We want to keep those questions in mind as we read our story. There's a new government. Texas has been ruled by many different governments. Before becoming part of the United States, Texas was under Mexico's rule. Prior to that, present-day Texas was under the rule of Spain. Texas has certainly seen its share of changes in the past 500 years. That's in classwork under social studies, Alexa. And various ruling governments are among those many changes. So those of you, if you've ever heard of or if you've ever been to that theme park Six Flags, there's a couple of them. Six Flags actually talks about how many different countries Texas has been a part of. So Texas has been a part of 6 different countries. It's been part of Spain, it's been part of France, it's been part of Mexico, it's been part of Texas, it's been part of the United States, and it's been part of the Confederate States. So it's had a lot of different countries that have been in charge of Texas. It wasn't always part of the United States. It's been part of a lot of different countries in the past. At the start of the 16th century, present-day Texas was inhabited by a group of Native Americans, the Aztecs. However, with European explorers having recently discovered the New World, things were bound to change. Change they did. In 1521, under the leadership of Conquistador Hernan Cortez, Spanish forces conquered the Aztecs and set up a new government. Under this new government, known as a viceroyalty, Spanish monarchs appointed viceroys, leaders that were tasked with governing large areas of land. So what that means is, like we've seen before in social studies, people in Europe started to send explorers over here to Texas. We saw that countries like Spain were sending people over, that people like France were sending people over to come and explore Texas. Spain, one of the things that they did was they also sent over people called conquistadors. Conquistadors were there to kind of take over places. So their job wasn't just to explore, it was wherever they went, they were supposed to take over that land and make it part of Spain. So their job wherever they went was to say, this land belongs to Spain now, it's Spain's. And if there were people there and they said, no, it's not Spain's, it's our land, their job was to fight those people to take over them and say, nope, it's Spain's now. So that's what Hernan Cortez's job was. Now, after they took over the land, what they would do is the king and queen of Spain would go ahead and say, okay, now that that land belongs to Spain, now that it belongs to me because I'm the king or the queen of Spain, I'm going to go ahead and put this person in charge of that land. So that person is going to be in charge for me. So kind of like if mom or dad has ever had to leave the house for anything, and then they tell you that, you know, your brother or sister is in charge, or if you have younger brothers and sisters, you might be the one in charge. That's kind of what the king and queen of Spain did. Because they weren't all the way over here in Texas, they said, okay, I'm going to make this person in charge of that area. They're going to be the ones in charge and they're going to be doing the job for me. In order to expand their territory to prevent other European countries, such as France, from claiming land in the newly discovered world, Spain set up a system of missions and presidios. Missions were religious settlements that served to spread Christianity and Spanish culture to the Native American group. So the missions were places where they had like churches. They would also have kind of like places for people to live. And in missions, they would teach the Native Americans who were living here, they would teach them about their religion, and they would also teach them jobs. So different things that they would do back in Spain, they would make them learn these jobs so that way they could work for the Spanish people here. Presidios were forts occupied by Spanish soldiers who protected the area. Together, the presidios and missions occupied large amounts of territory and kept Texas under Spanish control, under Spanish control till the early 1800s. So the presidios were a little bit different. The presidios, instead of having like a church and places for people to live, presidios were more like a fort, like a military fort. Like here in El Paso, we have Fort Bliss, very similar to that. So it was just soldiers that would live there in presidios. The reason why they needed forts, why they needed the presidios, was for two things. Number one, when the Spanish were over here and they were showing people about Christianity, when they were showing them how to do different jobs that they had back in Spain, not all the Native Americans liked it. They didn't like being told what to do. They didn't like being shown all this new stuff. So not all the Native Americans were kind of just going, yeah, okay, show me. They were very upset at the people from Europe that had come over, that had taken the land, and that were just telling them what to do. So some of them were fighting back. So presidios were there so that the soldiers could fight against the Native Americans who were upset that basically the people from Spain were telling them what to do. The second reason the presidios were there was because Spain was worried about other people from Europe, like people from France, coming over and trying to take the land and make it part of France. So the soldiers were there also just in case they saw anybody from like France or any other country. That way they could tell them, hey, this belongs to Spain, you need to leave. And if they didn't leave, they were there to fight with them. So with the presidios and the missions, they were able to keep control of Texas for a good amount of time. The missions were there so that way all the Native Americans learned what it was like to live in Spain, basically. What it was like to go to church, what it was like to have these different jobs that they had back in Spain. Presidios were there to kind of make sure that if they were being attacked from whoever, that they were there to fight back. Spanish rule over the land we now know as Texas came to an end in 1821. when Mexico won its independence from Spain. The government under Mexico's rule was quite dissimilar to that of Spain's. Mexico's constitution, which was adopted in 1824, created a government that was in many ways patterned after the United States government. Like the United States government, Mexico had a strong central government with 3 branches. It had representatives that were elected by the people and had an elected president and vice president that served 4-year terms. So eventually, the people that lived here in Texas and the area around it, what was Mexico at the time, or what became Mexico, they didn't like the way that Spain was doing things. They didn't like the rules and things like that Spain was having them follow. So eventually, they decided to fight against Spain. And they said, we don't like what you guys are doing. We don't like the rules that you guys have. We're going to make our own country. And they were able to win. So all this land here, Texas and the area around it, that used to belong to Spain, became Mexico. And so the Mexican government, like it says, was very similar to our government. Their constitution made 3 branches, just like our government has 3 branches. It made it so they would have an elected president, so people would vote to see who would be president and vice president, and they would be president or vice president for 4 years. So again, very similar to how our government works. Though the war had been won and a new government was established, Mexico's leaders still worried that some Native American groups, known as the Comancheria, posed a threat to Texas. Seeking to provide more stability to the area and a barrier between Mexican settlements to the west and the Comancheria to the east, the government accelerated the land grant process that had been started under Spanish rule. Over the next decade, 30 empresarios, or colony leaders, led hundreds of families to the area, and new communities, many of which are still in existence today, began to emerge. So one thing that was a problem for both the Spanish government and the Mexican government when they took over was they were still worried about the Native Americans. Just because the government was new doesn't mean the Native Americans all of a sudden went, oh, well, I guess it's okay if you tell us what to do. The other guys, we didn't like them, but you can tell us what to do. They were still upset that people were telling them what to do. And so the Mexican government was worried about, what are we going to do if the Native Americans keep fighting us? And their idea was, well, what we can do is we'll get a lot of people to move here, to move to Mexico. And if they move to Mexico and they like Mexico, then maybe they'll help us fight against the Native Americans who are mad at us. So they started to bring in lots of people to come and move and live here in what was Mexico at the time. To do that, they mentioned this, empresarios. Empresarios are people who are in charge of land. So the empresario would say, hey, I have a bunch of families that want to move to Mexico. I've already talked to them. They already know that they want to come move down here. And they would make a deal with the government and they would say, okay, if you pay me, I will get all of these families to move down here with me. So that's how they decided to get more people to move to Mexico. Is they would pay people to convince all these different families to move down to Mexico so they would have more people living in Mexico that could help them fight against the natives. So go ahead. You have 5 questions to answer. Remember to look back into the story, find your answers, and then each question has a box where you go ahead and click on it and type in your answer. Go ahead, answer your 5 questions. Finish answering all 5 questions, you can turn in your work.